I think if we send the video recording of that to our friend V. Wynn, he would say, yeah, that feels a lot like what Week of Compassion does. It's noisy, and it's messy, and it's mildly chaos, but it's all rooted in love. I think that's sort of defined Week of Compassion at its best right there. So thank you. Thank you to our kids for collecting all of their coins all week, and to you for making a joyful noise. Well, on this second week of our Lenten journey and our Lenten series of CrossWords, this week's word is vulnerability. And as Reverend Ryan said on Wednesday night during our Vespers service, that's really hard for him. But it's not hard for me at all. I just need you to know, I have no issue with vulnerability at all. Just so you know. But I will tell you that one of my biggest pet peeves is around this word. One of the things that drives me crazy, particularly from y'all, is when you apologize to me for crying in church. Drives me crazy. Drives me crazy because one of our jobs and goals as clergy folk is to try to help you tap into those feelings and emotions and allowing you to connect with the divine spirit that might cause you to feel something and allow you to be broke open by the Spirit. So for goodness sakes, please don't say, at least maybe other churches have different rules, but in this church, we don't apologize for crying in church. Deal? Deal. Okay, good. That's good, because I cried from the pulpit a couple weeks ago, and you let me come back, so thank you. Now, do you realize how rare that is of what you just did? It seems we are living in a world and in a culture, at least in our modern American culture, where vulnerability is bad. It has become, in many ways, one of the deadly sins. Because, as Reverend Suzanne said, it's synonymous with weakness, especially for our men and our boys, but certainly with our women and girls as well. If you're a boy who cries, someone will call you a sissy. Or worse yet, someone will tell you, oh, stop crying like a girl. That's not a compliment when they say that. And of course, for women, it just perpetuates the stereotype. And it seems that our cultural narrative is one where we regularly hear about how we needed to be hardened as a nation and as a people. We need to harden ourselves. We need to toughen up our kids, and our adults need to man up. I have no idea what that means, man up. Especially because as a person of faith and one who considers herself to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, man up and to harden ourselves seems to be antithetical, the exact opposite of everything that the life and teachings of Jesus the Christ points us toward. It seems to me now more than ever we need to be preaching and encouraging a gospel-focused message of providing a place where people can be vulnerable. And dare I say, a softening of humanity. Last week, after, I guess it's been almost 2 weeks ago now, after the school shooting in Parkland, Florida, I had someone come up to me and say, Reverend Shanna, because apparently when you're clergy and people know that, it ends up sometimes like confession at soccer games, okay? But all kinds of places. Laura's laughing because she knows this to be true. He says, I'm ashamed of who I've become this week. And I said, well, say more. And this person said, I barely batted an eye when the breaking news came across my smartphone about the school shooting. I was at my desk and I simply shook my head and thought, great, another school shooting. And everyone's going to have lots of thoughts and prayers, but that'll be about it. He said, and then I went back to my work. It seems that our hearts are plenty hardened, my friends. And during this season of Lent, it feels like, to me at least, the wisdom traditions of our faith are challenging us to be more Jesus-like, to be countercultural, just as Jesus was in his time. And this psalm this morning, this 22nd psalm, really shows us the vulnerable side of our faith. My God, why have you forsaken me? The ancient words of the psalmist cries out in despair and vulnerability. Sometimes we forget that these words, which we tend to so closely tie with Jesus and Good Friday and Jesus crying them from the cross, we forget that these words are not original to Jesus. Jesus, in his darkest moments, was drawing deep from within himself and remembering the words, the sacred wisdom of his faith tradition. Jesus shows us how to be people who can be vulnerable. He knew it was safe because his tradition taught him that. And I am worrying that our tradition is losing that softer side of humanity, that softer side of God. We see this example of Jesus being vulnerable over and over again in the scripture. The idea that we especially hold dear to in the month of December. When we sing, O come, Emmanuel. What does Emmanuel mean? God with us, right? Divinity in human form. And so it is so strange that we could think that the most powerful entity in the universe became so lowly and vulnerable as to be a human being. Of course, you may not know this, but there was an entire sect of Christians in the early church who said, well, Jesus couldn't actually have died on that cross, because, well, you can't kill God. And yet, in theory at least, my friends, we celebrate a vulnerable Jesus, a baby in a manger. A Jesus who prays, not my will, O God, but yours. Or to take it from an old hymn, have thine own way, Lord. Have thine own way, Jesus prayed in that garden. Or a Jesus on a cross who cries out, help me, God. Vulnerability is a part of the human experience, even for our Jesus. If you've been following along, if you've been reading the essays each week in the little David White book, David White says this about vulnerability. To run from vulnerability is to run from the essence of our nature. The attempt to be invulnerable is the vain attempt to become something we are not. Something we are not. Reverend Sue's mentioned Dr. Brene Brown. She is, I don't even know, arguably, but probably without argument, the foremost researcher / storyteller on vulnerability in our culture today. And if you listen much to her or read her accessible work, you'll hear her concern for how, as a culture, we are numbing ourselves to vulnerability. She knows this because she tells often about having grown up in a family where vulnerability was barely tolerated. None of that training wheels on a bicycle sort of thing. Just get on and go. And she says, we are numbing ourselves to our very selves when we try to avoid vulnerability. And when I first read this quote that she says in a lot of places, she says, you can't selectively numb emotion. You know, we try to numb the fear and the vulnerability, and we apologize for our tears and our shame of not being good enough. And by default, we end up numbing even our joy. She's a PhD, so she does this stuff for a living and seems to have a pretty good idea around it. You can't just numb one emotion. You'll end up numbing joy as well. You know, I made a joke about being vulnerable. And my spiritual director has really helped me in the last several years to realize, this may be a surprise to some of you, but I'm a doer. I'm a doer. That's what I do. Some of you, I know, are doers as well. And the thing about doers is we get so busy doing, we do not have time for these feeling things, right? They just get in the way. Because if I cry, then my mascara is going to run, and then it's going to be a mess, and, then I got to start over with my makeup. Well, that takes too long. And then I got to sort out all these feeling things, and, I got 47 things on my to-do list. So I say, feeling this vulnerable thing, you're precious. And I'm just going to take you over here, and I'm going to open up this door to my heart, and I'm going to set you safely inside this closet where nothing can hurt you, and I'm going to shut the door, and then I'm going to lock it. I got a big lock. I used to have a big lock. Father Joe doesn't let me have such a big lock anymore. And you're going to stay safe in there, and I'll come back, and I'm going to deal with you later. Except, do I really ever come back and deal with her later? Not generally. You got to have a big lock because at some point, that closet gets pretty full. Right? Closet starts to get full, and one day you walk over to your closet carefully holding whatever it is you don't want to be vulnerable about today, and you open the door, and what happens? Kaboom, all that stuff comes falling down on top of you. Well, then you just got a bigger mess. Really not going to get anything done today. I don't think I'm alone in that, partially because my spiritual director says I'm not, and partially because Dr. Brene Brown says I'm not. Some of you just do it differently. Some of you just shove it down. We're just going to stick it in a hole. We're going to put a manhole cover on it. Right? And then you put a big truck on top of your manhole cover. What happens when that pressure starts to get big? It's coming out one way or the other. I'm going to tell a story about Albert Darden. I didn't ask him. Sorry. Sometimes Albert, who's a professional, he's got a radar for this kind of thing because he's a professional. And he'll come up to me after church sometimes and he'll say, "How you doing today?" I say, "Oh, I'm fine, thank you." And he goes, "When you want to talk about that, you call me and I'll buy your lunch." Because, see, his meter goes off. Starts with a B. It's children's service, so we're not going to say it. But his meter goes off about when I'm not telling the truth. He's good. He's a handy one. He's dangerous, but he's handy to have around. We don't want to deal with it because our culture says you're a sissy or you're a girl. Cry, baby. Deal with that stuff. Dr. Brene Brown says even our religion has become numbed. We have numbed our relationships with God. We have numbed it with certainty. She knows this because she says, she's an Episcopalian. She says, academic research, if you're an academic, you know that academic research is about controlling and predicting, right? You set out your hypothesis, and then you have a control, and then you're going to try to predict what happens. And vulnerability is the exact opposite of that. Vulnerability is when you stop trying to control and predict and just be. Now, the scary part of that is for most of us, if everybody knew the stuff that's shoved into your closet, well, they might not like you very much. That's what you think, of course. So you have to be strong and you have to be brave and, none of this sissy stuff. That's what our culture, that's what our tradition is teaching us. And how many of us are listening to that rather than the countercultural message of Jesus? That's why that cross is hanging right up there. Because it is the exact opposite. This symbol is the exact opposite of everything that the culture is telling us about vulnerability. That you are not worthy of love and connection. You are not worthy of your tears. This 22nd Psalm from the psalmist and from our Jesus is one of pure vulnerability. My God, why have you forsaken me? And Dr. Brown says vulnerability is the very birthplace of joy and love and creativity and faith, which is perhaps why this passage is immediately followed by the 23rd Psalm. This psalm of fear and anxiousness and vulnerability is followed by an assurance that we are loved, we are beloved, and that we are never alone, and it is safe to be vulnerable in the presence of God. That even in our darkest and weakest moments, when we find ourselves at our most vulnerable, God is fully present. And that is the story of our Jesus and of his life and of his teachings. That is the promise. So at least in this place, my friends, we will not install a metal detector on the doors of our heart. We will not put an armed guard to the door of our souls. We will cling to the countercultural message of Jesus so that when we cry, my God, we might always hear the ancient words of our faith singing back to us this sacred promise.